All right.
Got it.
One, I am so pleased to be here with the esteemed professor, academic, amazing person, Dr. Donald Dutton. And also, I want to tell you that if you're following me, you should watch this Sunday because we're going to have Dr. Dutton on the Not on Record podcast at the law firm I work for, Newberg and Partners. So if you're not a subscriber, go check it out at least on Sunday where we have a longer discussion. But in the meantime, Don, we've known each other for a long time, and you're an amazing person to know. So I want you to tell people about what you do.
Well, I'm retired and I try to do as little as possible, but I have done in the past the following. I once upon a time got drawn into developing a training program for police that required improved domestic disturbance skills. So I started out teaching police how to intervene when they got a 911 call for a domestic disturbance, including heavy emphasis on police safety. I watch these things where on television where cops walk up the door all the time and stand right in front of the door. You don't do that for what should be obvious reasons. You stand to the side, knock on the door. Anyway, so we got the police trained, and in those days we were training the police largely to get abusive couples into social workers or psychologists or some medical professionals. There wasn't a heavy emphasis on arrest. That came in the early 90s. I started doing this, by the way, in 1980. Actually, in the 70s was the police training. So for a long time, there was this pre-arrest policy of getting psycho.
By the way, don't
Yeah.
date yourself too much because you look very young. So
Oh, well, yeah, I'm not. I mean, I'm same age as Joe Biden and Mick Jagger. So just Jagger led a rougher life than I did, and Biden, I don't know. Anyway,
no, it's amazing. And when you talk, it's very clear how long you've been doing this because you just spout off all this data and statistics and stuff. Just like, most people would have to read it, but it's just off the top of your head. You've done this so long and you know this stuff so well. It's amazing just to listen to you. So sorry
well,
to interrupt. Go ahead. Go
when
ahead.
you're teaching it, year after year after year, some of these studies get embedded in your brain. Even though you can't remember your best friend's name from the day before, you remember all the data for the study. Anyway, what happened was this. I mean, we got the police trained, and that was all well and good. But then people started to feel, well, we need something more. What do we do with these couples? Because an assault is an assault, even if it happens between
Just
intimates.
to make it clear, you said we got the police trained. So what was wrong with what they were doing and how did you
They just
fix it?
didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to handle a domestic disturbance. They said, it's social work. We have to go in and deal with people with high emotion. There's feelings involved. This is not police work. So it was changing their mindset as to it was police work because there was a risk of injury and there was some danger involved. So we had Doug Campbell was a progressive judge in Vancouver in those days. He was willing to set up a new domestic assault therapy program so that men could actually be, and it was all about men in those days. Nobody thought anything about female assault. Men who were convicted could go to therapy instead of going to jail or doing nothing, or being let out their own recognizance and told not to do it again. A lot of good that would do. Anyway, so then I started doing a therapy program with a fellow called Dale Trimble. We'd both been trained as group therapists and through the same system at something called Cold Mountain here in BC. And we believed that the idea of having a dozen guys all at once in a group setting for 16 weeks was a useful way to proceed, and which I think it was. Now we built into that some learning modules, and some of that learning comes out of what is now called cognitive behavioral therapy, having to do with emotion regulation and attachment, et cetera, et cetera. And we built in some learning about abuse and what it was and why it was a bad thing. But there was also group process going on in the group. The surprising thing about these groups was they were not filled with women haters. This wasn't true. Guys who expressed sort of negative generic statements about women sort of routinely were confronted in the group by the other men in the group. It's just a myth that what is not a myth is that some men were assaulted despite their own values, despite their own attitudes, and they didn't fully understand why they'd done what they'd done. And of course, part of
That's
our job.
interesting. It's interesting because
Yeah.
my experience with men is that men are desperate for female approval. That,
Oh,
there's
some might be.
patriarchy and all this other stuff. But yeah, like there's a great song is "What is a man without a woman?" Like, and
Well,
most guys that I encounter, like, they trust men to help them with certain things because men are movers and shakers. But really, what they want, most men, what I find is most men actually want female approval.
hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Doesn't ring with me, but maybe there's guys like that. I mean, I'm always wary of generalizations. All men are
Well,
like this
yeah,
or all
yeah,
women are like
no,
this.
I get what you're saying because like
Yeah.
that's one of the problems is that there's a lot of comments being said about what men are like and what women are like, and really we're all individuals, right? So,
Well, there's just so much individual variation in any major group.
but doesn't that play into most of the paradigm that we're facing in terms of policy and stuff like that, where they make assumptions about men being aggressive and women being
Yeah,
generous and emotional and all this other stuff? Like
yeah. I
most of
mean,
the policies are based on that, women being passive and men being aggressive.
yeah, and there's a lot of things. I mean, they just don't understand anything about psychology, and I don't think they want to know anything about psychology. I mean, first of all, we look at the incident surveys. If we count the numbers who commit serious assault, by which I mean they do something potentially injurious to another person, like punch them or kick them or worse, it's about 4%. And that's true for most demographic groups. A little higher for younger groups. It gets up to around 6%. Race doesn't have a huge effect. Gender doesn't have a huge effect. Women, in fact, are more likely than men are to do that. And the reason for that, I think, is probably pretty simple. That if you look at the studies of sibling violence, you see that for boys who have brawls with their brothers when they're 13 years old, that these things actually taper off by the time they get to 19 because their parents are saying, stop doing this, because their parents are afraid they're going to hurt each other. Girls who have brawls with their sisters, it does not taper off. So at 19, they're just as violent as they were at 13. It's just the whole thing again about not taking female violence seriously because we don't think they can really hurt each other.
Well,
Well, they can.
I don't think women take violence seriously because women don't expect to be hit back.
They don't expect to be hit back. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know what the expectations are. I mean, I know what the attitudes are. I mean, in North America, there's just general disapproval of either hitting your partner or even striking your partner back if they've hit you. And that's true for both men and women. I mean, it's not normatively accepted at all, despite what the early functionalist sociologists said about it being normative and, it was all the patriarchy and everybody was trying to support it. That was all nonsense, just complete academic nonsense by people who didn't know anything about the groups they were writing about. Except numbers on a page. That's all they knew. And I had the misfortune of getting into polemical debates with two or three of these guys, and they just didn't even want to know about the evidence.
Oh,
So,
polemical debates.
yeah, yeah.
Does that anymore? Yeah. This is one of the problems I think we're facing is that everybody's moving from polemical debates and having actual debates into being such ADHD kind of focused TikTok subscribers. Where
Oh, there's no depth.
the attention span is so short now that this is why I love doing these kind of long form interviews because really people need to focus and really turn their mind if they think they care about something, turn their mind to it and learn about it. And that's what's so amazing about you is like all this stuff. So what do you think? What do you think? And I know this is a big question. What do you think is the most important thing for people to focus on right now?
Focus on. You need policymakers or Joe back home, or
Well,
who do you?
do all of them, do all of them. Because I know focusing on, for various people is like different and what they should focus on. There's the general
Oh,
public needs to focus on keeping themselves sane, but the policymakers also need to focus on, and this is where you come in, policymakers need to focus on real data. They don't need to focus on, you know, advocacy groups that are out there saying, oh, women are victims or whatever, right? They need to focus on real data. And that's where you
advocacy
come in.
groups obviously serve a function, but in the course of serving that function, they have to get more simplistic and more strident, and they feel they have to do these things in order to be heard. The problem is the simplistic part, and there's so much policy and, in fact, even psychological theory written on interviews with battered women in women's shelters as though they generalize to the entire population. It's ridiculous. They don't generalize. They have a different life. They have a different violence pattern in their relationship. That's why they're in the shelter in the first place. It's called selective sampling. Anybody who's trained in social sciences knows you're not supposed to do that, but they do it routinely. It's crazy, and our policies are crazy for that very reason. They're based on this false structure. What they need to do is to figure out, just throw out these quasi-political models and pay some attention to the psychology of perpetrators and victims. I mean, if you don't do that, the law's not going to work. Just basically, it's not going to work. I mean, it's false psychology. It's going to fail. And that includes, so that means, first of all, they've got to pay more attention to couple interaction, because 50% of all domestic violence is bilateral. So they've got to look at that. You can't just treat one
Now, when
person.
you say bilateral, I know what that means. I know what that
Match the level of severity.
I know what that means, but can you explain it a little bit further for people who are watching and don't know much about it?
Typically, it means people get caught in a coercion trap. They get into an argument with their spouse, and I'm right, no, I'm right, no, I'm right, and the emotions get higher and higher and higher, and nobody can back off, and so finally it gets to the push and shove or worse, physical stage. And somebody gets hit, the police get called, and when this happens 85% of the time, the man gets arrested. At least that's what Deborah
I know.
Fitzpatrick says.
And
But
I don't want to give away too much because we have another discussion coming up on the podcast about the extreme situation of the state that men find themselves arrested. But this is all created on policy because they've heard from groups that presented fake science, right?
well, I don't even know to what extent they presented science. I mean, you look at some of the original,
Right.
the origins of feminist thinking. You look at Lenore Walker's work, for example. There was no no science in there. I mean, there were a few random
No,
interviews.
wait, Lenore Walker, she's the person who actually created the whole battered woman syndrome thing, right?
Yeah, she had no science to base it on, basically. I mean, in fact,
She,
20 years after she wrote that, Diane Follingstad wrote a chapter for the Handbook in Forensic Psychology and reviewed all the empirical studies that had been done on the battered woman syndrome. She found one, and I was the person who did it. There's been the only empirical study that had ever been done. Now, that's not to say, I've done two battered woman cases. One I did for the defense on the basis of the battered woman, and it was a textbook case. I mean, absolutely. And the other one was clearly malingered. I did it in Colorado, and this woman who shot her husband in the back and happened to be the beneficiary of the insurance policy, said she was a bad woman, except the night before she shot him in the back, she was out partying with the Hells Angels.
right.
So there were a few little issues like that didn't
Well,
really.
and I have a video on this case of Dahlia DiPolito who hired a hitman to kill her husband, and the guy freaked out, and then he told the police, and so she ended up hiring a policeman to kill her husband.
Is
And they
that the one
so
in the Maritimes some time ago?
it was
Was that
down in Florida, I think.
okay? Well,
Dahlia
because there was one in the Maritimes several years ago. There was same thing. They had her on camera
Mhm.
getting an RCMP guy to put a hit on her.
She's like, I'm 5,000% sure I want you to do this. Because the
Yeah,
officer's saying, once it's done, right?
yeah,
But he didn't know as an officer.
yeah.
He's like, are you sure you want to do this? She's, I'm 5,000% sure. Uh,
So, the bottom line is it can happen, or someone can be malingering it, and it's got to be a case by case thing in court. I mean, the idea that people can come in with these broad group generalizations like gender and just say, well, we don't even need courts anymore because women always tell the truth and men never do. I mean, absurd, totally absurd.
well, I think that's a danger actually when because of course I'm working in the criminal defense area right now, right? I see a lot of this stuff now. I've been doing this for like a number of years, obviously working with Joseph Newberger. He's been doing it for many more years than me. But this is one of those things. It's like it's constantly a situation where they say, well, women don't lie. Women are they should just be believed, right?
Can anybody say, there's something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It has a number of lie scales that are built into it. Those lie scales were developed through broad situational testing of normal people in the population.
Mhm.
And so you establish norms for lying, and you do it for men and women. They're not different. They're the same. I mean,
Oh my God, are you telling me that women lie?
yeah, sorry. Yeah,
That's fascinating.
yeah.
Because, there's been so much hype about how women are spiritual and, they're somehow different than men in some
Yeah.
sort of really a hierarchical. Women are like this, closer to God, and men are like, trying to work their way up. And this
Yeah, well,
actually is actually the mentality, despite the whole thing saying, oh, women are, discriminated against. Women are actually seen as here, right? They're normally seen as spiritually superior. So when
yeah, well, I did a
you do the
case.
studies, what do you find?
I did a case in Seattle where this spiritually superior woman convinced her boyfriend that she was being held down, her spiritual level was being held down by her family, and she was going to kill them. He could help her do this. He didn't have to, but of course, if he was really a man, he would. And they planned to wipe out her family, which they did on Christmas Eve, all six of them.
Oh,
And we wound up pleading folie à deux in court, which is a pretty rare defense, as I'm sure you know, because
pleading,
you
pleading,
have
can
to
you slow
convince that
that?
someone's conveyed their craziness over to another person. And in this case,
Can you repeat that though? I missed it. You ended up pleading what?
folie à deux.
Okay.
You haven't heard of that one? Okay,
No.
this is a rarely used defense, which means in effect that one person who is defiably mentally deranged convinces a second person that they see the world accurately. So if she's paranoid, she convinces him to be paranoid. Now, it's hard to prove this defense, but we did. And we saved this guy's life, even though he was instrumental in the killing of six people. But I mean, to say she put him up to it, she was brainwashing him 24/7 for a year and a half before he finally said, okay, I'll go along with it. And he just didn't have the mental ability to stand up to her. I mean, he was borderline personality, amongst other things. He couldn't, and she kept threatening that she was going to leave him, so he couldn't handle that. And he complied and was her infantryman in her war and her family in order to raise herself to a higher spiritual level.
Wow. Okay, so you have a doctorate in psychology, right?
I do.
And so how does it affect the way you view people around you in the world?
Well, I mean, I think it was okay until I started studying psychopathology, and I started knowing more about that. It makes me stay home more. Um, because there's a lot of it out there in the streets and even running for public office, without naming names. Yeah, you can't help but see it. And it kind of, I don't go into crowds anymore. I used to love the Easter beans out here on the West Coast, but of course that was a whole different scene. But I don't go into crowds now.
um, I used to think that because we mostly probably think we're sane ourselves, right? Even if you're crazy, you probably think you're sane. I used to think most of the people were just like me, and I assumed everybody was sane. I'm now as I'm getting, older, I started thinking most people actually have no clue what's going on. they're mostly like caught up more and more, especially with social media. I think they're caught up in their own um, web and circle of things that reinforce what they believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Social media has turned out to be disastrous that way. I mean, almost every measure of psychopathology at a social level has jumped up noticeably with the advent of the cell phone. It's I mean, you name it, it's there. And everything from suicides to attacks on strangers to people just going wacko on airplanes and trying to jump out. It's all been since basically 1999 or thereabouts when we got into smartphones and had our own little world, just bouncing our ideas of the universe back to us and saying, yeah, you're right, yeah, you're right, yeah, you're right. So everybody's got their own little rabbit hole that they can cyber slide down into.
Well, it's a problem that people are attracted to things that tell them they're right. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
so they're more likely. You can read like 10 different reports on something, and you're more likely to believe the ones that reinforce the things that you already believe to be true.
Oh, there's some brilliant social psychological studies on that by Lee Lepper and Ross, where they took people who were pro or against capital punishment and gave them two studies. One that supported capital punishment, said there was a drop in recidivism when it happened. The other one found completely the opposite. And then they asked their opinions, and they just totally methodologically trashed the one that didn't agree with them and thought the one that supported their views was a wonderful study, even though there was methodologically no difference between the two studies.
Well, every study that supports your point of view is wonderful, right?
That's what they found.
So let's talk about that for a second, because this is one of the things that we've discussed before. You can get a study to support pretty much anything you want to, right?
Pretty much. I mean, if you took the whole, if it had been broadly studied and you read all the relevant literature, then you might sometimes get shocks that it's not supporting what you believe. A lot of people believe in prayer, for example. There's a brilliant study done by Herbert Benson, who took 3 different groups of people who had equivalent cardiac problems and had people pray for one and not pray for another, and then pray for a third group, and the third group was told they were being prayed for. No difference between group 1 and 2, and group 3 did worse. And there was like 300 some people per group, and they all had equivalent cardiac problems. Well, people who believe in prayer, they don't like to read that study.
Well, I lived in Barrie, Ontario when a tornado hit, and I was living there that year, and it was a lot of people died, and it's crazy to be in a place. I get more scared by wind than anything else, actually, but there was a weird phenomenon in which a tornado went through, tore the back of a building off, and jumped over a church. Jumped over a church, and then tore the back of every house down. Four houses on the other side.
God's plan.
You know what happened? You know what happened? Everybody started going to that church.
Yeah, I know what happened.
Everybody started going to that
Yeah,
church.
of course.
So, but
Too bad he couldn't have saved the people in front and behind the church. Oh well.
I know.
Yeah.
But how we make decisions and how, so I'll tell you, like, just to get a little bit off topic, maybe not, because everything is, for somebody who's got a doctorate in psychology, everything's on topic. One of my favorite writers ever is Ernest Becker, who unfortunately died at a young age.
Brilliant
And
guy.
I know. And my daughter went to Simon Fraser, and I was so happy because that's where, Simon Fraser took him in when he got ousted from the US.
Yeah.
Controversial. But he whittled the problem of life down to a simple phrase. We need to feel like a person of worth in a world of meaning.
Yeah, and I mean, he built a psychology that was a human psychology. It didn't care about groups. He said everybody's got the same problem. It's wording off an awareness of death, that death awareness is crippling. We can't handle it. As far as we know, we're the only animal.
Quivering little piles of jelly, I think they say.
Well, basically, yeah. I mean, the whole notion of our finitude and in both
Most,
time
most
and
people,
space.
most people deny this, that they're afraid of death. Just like, oh, I'm okay with dying. Yeah,
Yeah,
but no, what we're talking about is the realization that you could die anytime without even knowing it,
yeah.
without, involvement in this thing. It could just happen to you anytime and we don't know.
Well, I always like Woody Allen's line about death. I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens.
I know. I know. I just want it to be nice and peaceful. Um,
But Woody Allen was a big Ernest Becker fan too. In fact, he showed, I think, the denial of death in one of his early movies.
yeah. Oh no,
Yeah,
he's done so much amazing work.
yeah,
Um, but one of the things, let's look at this. Um, People need to feel like a person of worth and a world of meaning. Women have historically, and I'll admit this, I'm generally not a big fan of saying, well, women are victims or whatever. Women have historically not had access to power in the same way that men have. But what I'd like to say is that I've grown up female, and women have learned other ways to access power.
sure. In fact, here, let me add one on that's kind of interesting. I mean, we all sort of know that until the women's movement kicked into gear, that women were not being given equal opportunities in the workforce. They didn't have equal power in the world of work. What isn't known is that back in 1975, when Murray Strauss did the first family violence survey, he also asked everybody in the survey about power sharing in their family. Who had the final say on major decisions, and blah, 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 blah. The bottom line was that most families had an equal power sharing deal. And of those that had a single power sharing deal, men were only like 2% more than than the women were. It was like 9% versus 7% or something like that. It wasn't as black and white as it's now portrayed. So one of the ways that women made up for their lack of power in the workforce was that they wielded more at home, and a lot of husbands would kind of give in to that. Now, power is really interesting in cross culturally in terms of domestic violence because in patriarchal countries, there's way more violence against women, and when their socioeconomic power is very low. But as it starts to increase, it gets to this point where it's not even equivalent to male power yet. It's at 0.75. But at 0.75, women commit more domestic violence than men do.
I know, and we've kind of like talked about this before in the past because we've met each other a few times, but it is so interesting that most of the domestic violence the studies show in male-female relationships is reciprocal or bilateral, as you say.
Yeah, yeah.
When it's one directional, it tends to be only slightly higher, but it tends to be more likely to be women. And then it was like when you have gay male relationships, where it's like two men in a relationship, the violence goes down in percentage. When you have two females in a gay relationship, it goes up.
I've always said when women have to live with women, they're worse than men.
I'll bitch slap that mother. you know, but no, but I do think it's a problem, and like I also shared a story about like growing up, having to fight as a kid or whatever, and I think I shared that story with you. And the best thing that ever happened to me when I was a kid was like I got punched in the jaw by a guy, and it's like, oh, I don't like that. And most girls don't get hit because they can do whatever they want to, right?
Yeah.
And they fight with impunity. They're just like, and there's so many videos. Like I'm not just saying this is out of my own experience, but you can see this on YouTube. There's all these videos of women who just go up to a guy, just punch them, and then as soon as the guy hits them back again, they're like, "Oh my God!"
Yeah, it happens in hockey fights too. It's always
What's
the
that
second
about?
guy that gets the penalty.
What what's that about?
Well, I mean, there's that, the famous sort of YouTube thing where,
Sorry.
um, you know, a woman, man and woman are sitting on a park bench and there's passersby and she hits them with a newspaper or something and everybody just goes on by. But if they do it the other way around, then everybody runs over and half of them are on their cell phones calling the police. I mean, there's a systematic study on this that Susan Sorensen did in LA, where she took exactly the same domestic violence incident, and half the time it was a man doing it to a woman, and the other half it was flipped around. And she asked people a variety of questions. What should happen? What would you rather if the man does it? They're all saying call in call the cops. If the woman does it, well, he must have done something to deserve it.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
It's a totally different zeitgeist around male violence and female violence. And I mean, you look at studies that are done on criminal justice handling. I mean, there was one really good one done in Canada, and it's just different every step of the way.
Why do these studies? Why do these studies not change policy?
Why? Because politicians care more about who's voting for them than they care about the data.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's just how am I going to get reelected? That's number one.
Yeah, and it's never a good thing to be seen as going against
That's the only numbers that they
violence
care
against
about. How how many
violence
how
against
many are
women.
voting for me? Yeah.
And like we've talked a little bit about so there's a phenomenon called parental alienation, which a lot of my viewers are familiar with. Um, and it's not always one directional. Parental alienation is a yeah,
Yeah, that parental alienation. Yeah.
yeah, parental alienation. I mean,
Yeah.
I was trying to describe it to somebody last night actually, and they're like, "What do you mean?" Like, you know, why would a kid say something against their parent that's like criminal, right? Because like, of course, it crosses over from just family courts to criminal courts because a lot of these things end up in criminal allegations, and like, and that's one of the things that we face in criminal court. Why would a child say such a terrible thing about their parent? And parental alienation
Well,
so
it's a
toxic. It's
well,
so unbelievable. The extent
it's
to which
what it
the
is.
child's mind can be warped.
Well, it's a micro cult, right? I mean, it's cult behavior. It's the same as we see in cults, except in this case, the one parent is the cult leader, and the kids are the cult followers, and they adopt the social reality that the parent hands them. So the parent tends to blame the other parent for everything that went wrong, including the divorce. And they're such a bad person. You can't believe all the bad things they did to me. The kids are going to take that on, and they're not exactly critical thinkers. So what you get, when you get them in court, you get the kids just mimicking what parent A is saying about parent B. And a lot of times, parent B is a bad person. Well, why is that? Well, we're not sure, but we just know he's a bad person. I mean, yes, it goes on. I don't know how anybody could say it doesn't exist. There have been a number of studies done on it, including impact on the parents. There's a book that Amy Baker did.
There's a difference, though. There's a
Tons
difference.
of it.
There's two phenomenon that I've seen in courts. One is where the child actually believes this thing happened because a false memory was implanted in their mind. So that's
Sure.
one thing, and that's more difficult. And I feel so bad for these kids because they actually believe it happened.
Yeah.
There's another
Yeah.
one where the kids are so incensed against the other parent because they got this hatred implanted that they
Yeah.
knowingly lie. There's two
Yeah.
different phenomena that happen there.
No, that's a good point. I can see them both. Absolutely. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. I mean, they're both kind of spin-offs of this kind of unilateral socialization that's going on, this kind of, cult membership that's being fomented by the other parent. Yeah.
What do you think though? Like I actually talked to a prosecutor. I do have a couple of prosecutors who are friends because they're not all evil Satans. Um, but I did suggest at one point that if somebody implants a false memory of abuse, and then that child has to then grow up believing they were abused because they have this false memory, isn't that parent who did that? Isn't that parent guilty of sexual assault?
It's, in my view, it's child abuse. In my view, that is a form of child abuse.
And I
It
find
would be, it's emotional abuse for sure.
I have encountered a number of these cases where the kid is not actually lying, where the kid actually believes this thing happened and but it's a false memory.
Yeah.
And but I realize, and you're a psychologist, right? You got to think about this. This kid is going to grow up believing this thing happened to them.
Yeah.
That is a false memory.
Yeah.
But Then also this one case, it was so fascinating because they sometimes when the courts actually do find parental alienation, they can order reparation therapy, right? That the child then went to reparation therapy and said, you don't understand. What you're telling me is to not even believe my own memories. This
Yeah,
is hard for me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I get it.
I know this is the
Yeah,
big problem, right?
yeah, absolutely. So I gotta wrap this up because I've got some house things going on here right now that I have to deal with. I know you're coming out next week, so do you want to just
Vancouver, yes.
call me when
Yes.
you get
Oh,
here?
oh, I can't wait to meet you.
We can have lunch or whatever works for you.
That would be lovely. That'd be lovely. Yeah,
Yeah.
because
I'll have a
I'm
bit more time next week. I'm just dealing with some house issues these
yeah,
2 days.
yeah,
Getting,
no, no, this
getting
is lovely.
nice.
And I really just when we did the podcast, it's and this is going to come out before the podcast does, but people should really go watch it because you're just a wealth of information, and I wish I could just pick your brain every day. Can
Well, you can pick it
I
next week anyway.
I'm making my surrogate parent so I can just call you every day when I
Okay. Sounds good. Well, call me next week and we'll set something up when you
Yeah,
get here.
yes, we'll definitely.
It's gonna rain till Wednesday and then it gets
Thank you
nice.
so much for being here. And everybody, you should go buy Don Dutton's book. He's amazing, Rethinking Domestic Violence. And you should also, yeah,
Just happen to have a copy here.
hold it up a little bit higher. Yeah, I have the same book. We have it right behind us on the podcast at work. Amazing stuff, and everybody should know what he has done. All this research, your work, your life has worth and meaning, Mr.
Great.
Dutton.
Thank you.
All
See
right,
you next week.
I'll talk to you soon. Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.